Oh,
okay. Well, we're here today to talk about a defining text of Canadian nationalism, A Lament for a Nation. And joining me here is the illustrious student Ty Bradley, who has been researching this book, and he hopes to make it relevant to our modern audiences. So Ty, can you tell me a bit about the author? Who was George Grant?
So thanks for asking, Josh. It's a great question to get started. George Grant was a Canadian political philosopher, though he spent most of his career teaching religion. So Grant was an old-fashioned Tory in the British tradition, which is very different than modern conservatism as we understand it in Canada. So he believed very strongly in tradition, religion, and community, rather than emphasizing individual liberties as modern conservatives tend to do. So despite being conservative, he inspired many young leftists with his anti-American sentiment. So his talking of the US as an empire in this book that we'll be talking about today likely reminds you of all the campus Marxists that you'll encounter on the University of Ottawa campus. So he became beloved among the left because of this book, but he always rejected socialism and the NDP because he saw their morality as liberal, couldn't tolerate their pro-choice stance on abortion. But he worked really closely with a lot of New Democrats, that really prominent socialist, political economists like Gad Horowitz was a radical leftist who he collaborated with a lot. And he said there's something quite unique about a conservative philosopher who was so admired by the left. Also, Mel Watkins, a socialist political economist, one of the founders of the Waffle, which is a group that sought to transform the NDP into advocating for a socialist and nationalist country. He was very inspired by this book, Lament for a Nation.
Okay, so can you tell me a bit more about Lament for a Nation?
Yes, Lament for a Nation.
Lament for a Nation, my mistake.
Lament for a Nation is basically a book saying that because John Diefenbaker's government was defeated by the more cosmopolitan Pearson, that Canada would inevitably cease to exist. So Grant says that Canadian elites looked down on Diefenbaker because he was like a rural populist, and they united to defeat him. He says that the Liberal Party, for the 20 years before 1957, when Diefenbaker was elected, had been pursuing policies that would lead to the disappearance of Canada. So very internationalist, kind of pro-trade, rather than traditional defenses of Canadian culture. So Grant argues that during the war, Canadian elites shifted from looking to the UK for leadership to looking to the US. And he talks about how Canada had transformed into becoming a branch plant economy. We think about, you're from St. Catharines, you think about all those factories there who exist primarily to export to the US. So Grant prefers John A. Macdonald's tradition of Canadian nationalism and protectionist economics over that kind of trade-based economy. He talks about Diefenbaker kindly, but he also thinks that Diefenbaker's nationalism was ineffective because he was too capitalist. And I know a conservative saying someone's too capitalist. We wouldn't hear that nowadays. He said that Diefenbaker kind of was pro-business still, and to be a proper nationalist, he would have needed to encourage Canadian industry more, and he shouldn't have given it to the continentalist business interests because they were never going to support him anyways, basically what Grant's saying, because they were going to support the Liberals no matter what. So Grant kind of centers the discussion around foreign policy as well, because Diefenbaker kind of wanted a more independent foreign policy, while Pearson wanted to follow the American lead, is how Grant portrays it.
That's definitely an interesting book to think about in the modern context of, especially in the Trump era, kind of understanding all of that. That's interesting. So tell me more about some of the main ideas expressed throughout Lament for a Nation.
So there's a significant conservative critique of over-reliance on technology and an emphasis on the value of culture rather than individualism. He wouldn't be the kind of guy who thinks about everything in terms of graphs and charts. He's a very religious guy. He believes in a very localized tradition, in very localized traditions and values. So even Mel Watkins, that leftist guy I told you about, he said on a TVO panel a couple of years ago that he thinks Grant would be enthused about emerging demands for sovereignty for Indigenous nations, as he was always very supportive of long-standing traditions and self-determination. So the main ideas are really about sovereignty and resisting foreign domination.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, kind of in line with what you're saying. So can you just enlighten us a bit more on the cultural setting that the book was published in, what was going on in Canada and the US at the time?
Yeah, of course. It's super important to consider the context in which it emerged, because it's very different from Canada before and the Canada that we live in too. So this book was published in 1965, immediately after the defeat of the Diefenbaker government. That's kind of what it's about. And to Grant, this defeat represented the defeat of Canadian nationalism by Canadian elites who favored integration with the US. So, and this was also during the Cold War. That's really important to consider because there's all these foreign policy implications. And he writes about all these ideas for how Canada could stay sovereign, how it would be possible. And one of them is he calls it Castroism, by allying with the USSR. He says, obviously, Canada won't do that just because our values are completely different. And he talks about how Canadian foreign policy was becoming totally blindly adherent to the American foreign policy, like especially during like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like people were enraged that Diefenbaker wasn't following Kennedy's lead immediately. But we have to ask, has he been proven wrong because Canada stayed out of Iraq and Vietnam? Doesn't that show that we do have an independent foreign policy? So, and also in other contexts, this follows in 1956 Gordon Royal Commission Canada's Economic Prospects, and that commission recommended a mild program of economic nationalism, but it was totally ignored by the Liberal Prime Minister at the time. So they weren't really interested in the economic nationalism that Grant promotes. There were a few of these royal commissions in the 50s on how Canada-US trade relations are important, but how Canada should stay totally sovereign. There's a really interesting author I want to tell you about, Asa McKercher, and he's a historian at the Royal Military College. And he's written a couple of articles about this era, especially on international relations, because he's a military guy, of course. So there's this idea of the Pearsonalities, where the Foreign Service was dominated by the Pearsonalities during the Diefenbaker era, i.e. the bureaucrats were still loyal to Pearson and the Liberals, because the Liberals kind of represented the entrenched interests. So that's kind of why Grant says that Diefenbaker's foreign policy was so inept, was because the civil service was actively defying them. And McKercher gives some great examples of how that happened. He has testimony and everything. And then McKercher also talks about how Diefenbaker's foreign policy may have been undermined by the Pearsonalities because he was trying to pass a motion at the UN condemning Soviet colonialism, which the Pearsonalities opposed. They thought it was unnecessary. So it might be that he wasn't being undermined by the Liberals because of his US stances. It might have been that he was undermined because of the Soviet colonialism. So that kind of goes against what Grant was saying. Obviously, Grant was trying to tell a tightly controlled narrative about like US domination of Canada and like how Canada will cease to exist. McKercher also has a book called Camelot in Canada, where he repeats a lot of Grant's arguments about how increased American control of the economy and cultural homogenization were happening. McKercher thinks that liberal nationalists were still an important factor during the Pearson, Saint Laurent King era, and Grant kind of ignores that. McKercher notes that like in the period, like he doesn't mention Lament for a Nation, but it's important to put this into the context. Like in the years after Lament for a Nation happened, but there was the Vietnam War, which is heavily opposed in Canada. So that may have allowed a more nationalist outlook on the liberal side of things to emerge right after this book was written, basically.
Yeah, but that's definitely a tough balance to strike between the trade interests and the sort of national identity as both cultures are changing. That's a very interesting time period to be studying. That's right. So can you tell me a bit about what like modern liberal and conservative parties represent in this book?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's important because you said modern, but it's important to remember these are different parties. You know, because the Conservative Party, as we know it today, is a merger with Alliance, the Canadian.
You mentioned
Alliance,
that earlier. The differences,
who are very like free trading kind of classical liberal people, versus the PCs that this guy's writing about, that Grant's writing about, were very nationalist in tradition, and like their origins are really in loyalty to the crown, versus the liberals' loyalties are to business traditionally. It's a little different nowadays, so it's important that we think about how the parties have changed since then. So Grant kind of writes about the Liberal Party as like the instrument of the establishment, and he goes through a few scenarios for how the liberal policies could be justified. And he says like it could be a realistic defense of the country because they bow down to interests while maintaining Canada. But he says, no, that's not realistic. Like the liberals are definitely getting rid of Canada. He says one thing that you could justify the liberals for is that they accept annexation as inevitable and make it as fast and painless as possible by integrating our economies.
That's pretty scathing critique. Oh my God.
Yeah, but then he also says, he still says that liberals are the ones that recognize the French Canada as essential to Canada. He kind of thought that Diefenbaker, while a good English Canadian nationalist, kind of misunderstood the need for Quebec as part of an important Canada. So basically, he hates liberals like Grant. He says that all sovereignty has been lost under liberal regimes. And he talks about how the bureaucrats serve the liberal international Western order rather than Canada. And he thinks the liberals is very technocratic and not really thinking of things morally. Okay, so like the important players in each of the parties at this time are important to go over. So there's Pearson, and he's the guy that terrifies Grant. He's just come into power. And Grant thinks that, okay, this is the end of Canada. And because Pearson was open to having American missiles on Canadian territory, and he had a lot of backing from elites who benefit from continentalism, like integrated economies. And like I mentioned, the Pearsonalities, that's an important part of Pearson's persona at the time, because Pearson was a celebrated foreign service officer before he went into being the prime minister. And then there was King, who was the prime minister during most of this period when Grant said that we were barreling towards losing our sovereignty. And then an important character here is C.D. Howe. Now, Grant mentions him a few times because Howe represents everything that Grant hates. Howe came from a business background. He's known as a strong manager. He was tasked with munitions industry during the war, and then trade and economic development after. And he was known as the minister of everything. He kind of ran everything. And nowadays people compare him to Chrystia Freeland. Right? Well, they call her the minister of everything because people say she's in charge of everything, but it's pretty different, because like Chrystia Freeland comes from a more left-wing journalistic background versus Howe was solidly on the business side of things. Like
he was the $1 a day politician during the war,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
so he was tight with the business community.
Yeah,
and then on the conservative side, we kind of have an equivalent to Howe, and his name was Donald Fleming. And he came from the same kind of Bay Street business side of things, but he was a Tory. And he kind of undermined Diefenbaker's nationalism, according to Grant, because he brought that capitalist impulse that made it impossible for Canada to develop a sovereign economy. And then, of course, the most important figure in this is Diefenbaker, the outgoing prime minister, who was just defeated by the elites after gallantly trying to save the nation. But Grant thinks that this defense was pointless, basically, because he thinks Canada's bound to go anyway.
Sort of conception of nationalism is very community oriented and less business and capitalist oriented.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right on. Okay. So can you tell me just what is the history of Canadian nationalism that preceded this book? Explain that a bit more.
All right. Yeah. So different Canadians have different interpretations of what constitutes nationalism. So like often we talk about conservatives like John A. Macdonald because they resisted American influence and favored ties with the British. Like people like Richard Gwyn, who wrote biographies of John A. Macdonald, say that because of John A.'s protectionist policies, it's the only reason we stayed sovereign. So they're kind of seen as the traditional nationalists, that they maintained the British connection, which was the only thing that kept us from the strong economic pull of the Republican power in the South. But other people consider like Mackenzie King and that kind of and Laurier to be that tradition because they were nationalists in that they got us away from Britain. They took us away from that imperial control. And Grant actually writes about the period between them taking us away from British control and us fading into American control as our brief period of sovereignty between the two empires. So of course, like everyone knows, we learned this in basic history class, that like following the First World War, we started identifying more as Canadians. So that was kind of an important point for Canadian nationalism too. And then this book, it's in 1965. So it's kind of during the Cold War and after the Second World War. So it's kind of an important nationalism emerging then, where it's around these years when we get like bilingualism and the flag and those kind of things that are important to our Canadian identity.
Sorry, can you just tell me a bit about the history of Canadian nationalism that followed this book? How did it change and influence?
So, okay, so now we're kind of getting away from what Grant said and getting into what I think, which is what I love to talk about. Because I bring this kind of perspective of a young person in politics that isn't present in this book because it was written 50 years ago.
Fair enough.
So I think Canadian nationalism was renewed by Pearson and Pierre Trudeau following this book. I think he was wrong about Pearson. So we had the introduction of measures like universal healthcare, the charter, bilingualism, maple leaf flag, that are all like the foundation of our Canadian identity that's different from the UK and the US now. And then like Pierre Trudeau had resolutely economic nationalist policies that kept us totally sovereign, in my opinion. Robert Bothwell has a chapter in the excellent essay collection, Trudeau's Shadow, where he goes over how independent Trudeau's foreign policy was. So like Trudeau condemned the American bombing in Vietnam. He took initiative in relations with China and Cuba. It was like outside of American control. So like it's not like Grant says that the liberals just always go along with the American lead on foreign policy. And in fact, it would indicate the opposite. And Pierre Trudeau kept us out of Vietnam. Jean Chrétien kept us out of Iraq. And then meanwhile, like the history of nationalism kind of flips because a Tory prime minister, Brian Mulroney, in 1984 is elected. And then in 1988, there's a free trade election. And the Tories are the ones on the side of free trade. So that's not the Tories and the Grant's talking about at all. It's more business oriented, kind of classically liberal Toryism that emerged. So there was kind of a role reversal of continentalists and nationalists in that election. Like even like John Turner was the leader of the Liberal Party. He was opposing free trade and defending like a sovereign Canada.
Yeah, it's like, weird that his conception of Tories at the time kind of flips and it's the opposite. Exactly. exactly what he's critiquing.
Like you had the left-wing liberal Lloyd Axworthy mentioning Lament for a Nation in the House of Commons in 1988, like quoting this old-style Tory to argue against free trade and against foreign ownership of the economy. So, and it's interesting because like John Turner was the one fighting against free trade and against foreign ownership, but he can be seen in the same tradition as C.D. Howe, because they're both Bay Street Anglophone liberals. So like they're similar in their origins, but C.D. Howe is seen in this book as being the agent of continentalism, versus John Turner fought that election against continentalism.
That's crazy. So you've kind of touched on this a bit, but just on a whole, how would you sum up? What do you think? How much of Grant's predictions were fulfilled? How did that sort of play out in the aftermath of this book leading up to now?
Yeah, well, that's very subjective, obviously, like what you consider sovereignty. But like, if you went around Canada, Ottawa campus, and you asked people what their favorite TV shows are, what would they say? You know, they would probably say Mad Men and Breaking Bad and BoJack Horseman, all these American shows. And like, even you talk to Canadians, they know more about American politics a lot of the time than Canadian politics. People only ever talk about Trump and Biden because they find it more interesting and relevant and exciting. But like, I mean, on the other hand, like Grant was actually predicting that Canada as a sovereign entity would legally cease to exist. So like that obviously hasn't happened. We're still a country, but like, is our culture sovereign? That's up for debate. You know, and like I think over the next,
is any culture sovereign though? There's
true.
It's hard to define those
like
lines.
Globalization is what came after this, and that kind of fulfilled Grant's prediction that culture would be homogenized, the American empire would be expanded. You know, and I think over the next few days, as next few decades, as climate change gets worse, like maybe we will get an X, because they do need access to our resources. So like our continuing sovereignty will probably be dependent on making our resources accessible to American businesses. So like, how do we really have sovereignty then?
That's a good point. Yeah. And so, sorry, you touched on this term a little bit earlier, but can you just define for everyone, what is continentalism?
Yeah, that's really important to like Lament for a Nation. So it's the idea that Canada and the US should be like fully economically, politically, and culturally integrated. So Grant kind of sees the liberals and the business interests that they represent as the agents of continentalism.
Okay, and so continentalism is like in a legal sense one country, or is it just that all of those are completely aligned?
Well, it's not a legal term. It's more of a philosophical one.
Okay,
it's like the idea that of an integrated continent rather than divided into nations.
Into separate nations. Okay, makes sense. Yeah. And then just to wrap up, what can Grant's ideas been found in modern Canadian politics? Which parties represent it? Like, how are those finding their way?
So his hostility to integration with the US has been largely abandoned by both the liberals and conservatives in favor of a free trade consensus. The NDP supports economic nationalism, but they're also increasingly decolonial, which doesn't square with Grant's passion for Canada's existence as a British Tory nation. And and his idea of the Tories being the defenders of Canada as a sovereign nation is very outdated. You know, it's Pierre Poilievre espouses a distinctly American form of libertarianism that is essentially the opposite of Grant's Toryism. Yeah. So like the conservatives follow a doctrine of the free market nowadays, while Grant promotes socialism. So like it's not relevant in that way. And like the liberals are the continentalist villains of Grant's world, but now they're seen to be the more nationalist option. Like in recent debates over Bill C-10 on internet regulation, liberals have argued for the promotion of Canadian content, while conservatives have argued for allowing customers to choose Canadian content.
Or American.
Yeah, but like I think it is important to consider the continuation of Canadian sovereignty as an important political issue. Like our politics nowadays seems to be influenced by transnational ideologies oriented around social justice and populism rather than on specific Canadian concerns. Like we've seen issues of Canadian nationalism come up, of course, so like it is relevant in that sense. Like when it was revealed in the 2019 election that Andrew Scheer is an American citizen, or in the 2011 election when the Conservatives energetically campaigned against Michael Ignatieff, by the way, the nephew of George Grant, on the grounds that he had spent decades of his life living in America, identifying as an American. So like, and also, Grant talks about Quebecois nationalism, and it's still broadly similar to how he portrayed it back then, because they're so passionate about conserving their nation. Because he talks about René Lévesque, and he said René Lévesque must be arguing for a cultural nationalism more than just language, because he says New Orleans is a nice place for tourists. Otherwise, like, you're not just trying to preserve the language. So like you can kind of see that today in the action the Quebec government is taking to preserve their culture on like secularism issues.
Yeah, and that comes up a lot in debates in the House of Commons of like, especially of the Bloc Québécois, they make a lot of noise about preserving Quebec identity in that context.
Yeah, like Canadian nationalism is certainly different than it was in the 1960s. And I don't I think many people think about the fact that Canada could cease to exist. And
Mhm.
most Canadians seem happy to have strong economic relations with America and participate in the homogenization of global culture. But I think it is an important book for young people to read. It's traditionally considered one of the most important treatises of Canadian political theory, but I don't think I know anyone else my age who's read it. So it is important to understand what makes the Canadian political tradition different from the American side of things. It's
For
also
sure.
a window into what Toryism can be grounded in, as I would argue that modern Canadian conservatism is grounded in arguing for the opposite of what liberals want nowadays, rather than this book's grounding in the community, the nation, the collective well-being, you know.
Fair enough. Well, Lament for a Nation, anyone at home, please, on Ty's recommendation, you should come pick it out. Sounds like a really interesting book. And just any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I've had a pleasure chatting with you. I love this book, and if anyone wants to see the sources that I use, I have a collection of what historical sources I've used to back all this up, because I didn't make it all up.
Perfect. That's good to hear. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. We're really lucky to have you, and thanks for talking to us a bit about Canadian politics and this really interesting book.
All right, thank you. Have a nice day.
Yeah, thanks so much.